This is a completely fictional cinematic story created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely fictional. They didn't even wait for the ink to dry. That was the part that made Caleb Turner's stomach turn later, when he finally understood what he'd walked into. The attorney, a thin man named Gerald Foss with a voice like dry paper, had shown up at the shop on a Tuesday morning with a briefcase that probably cost more than Caleb's truck. He hadn't introduced himself the way normal people do. He just laid a folder on the hood of the '94 Chevy Caleb had been rebuilding and said, "We need a husband. You need money. I'd say that makes us both very lucky men." Caleb had looked at him the way you look at someone who's just said something in a foreign language. "Excuse me?" But Gerald Foss didn't look like a man who repeated himself often. He flipped open the folder and pointed to a number at the bottom of the first page. Caleb looked at it. Then he looked up. Then he looked at it again. "That's not a typo," Foss said. "Before we go any further, if you've never been to this channel before, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now, because every week we bring you stories that will genuinely shake you. Drop a like on this video and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. We want to see exactly how far these stories travel. Now, let's get into it. The town of Grey Ridge, Vermont didn't have much, but what it had, it kept. That was the thing about small towns. They held on to things long after they'd outlived their usefulness. Old grudges, old buildings, old names. Turner's Auto, the shop Caleb had grown up in, was all three of those things at once. It sat on the far end of Maple Creek Road with a hand-painted sign that his father, Roy Turner, had made himself back in 1987 using a stencil kit and a can of white exterior paint. The letters had faded to a soft gray over the decades, which felt about right for a place that had been quietly dying for the last 4 years. Roy had died 18 months ago, and the bank hadn't been patient about waiting for the grief to pass. Caleb was 38 years old, and he looked it. Maybe a couple years older, if he was being honest with himself, which he usually was. He had the hands of someone who'd been working with them since he was 13. Knuckles that never fully healed. A scar along his left thumb from a timing chain incident he didn't talk about. Dark circles under his eyes that weren't from laziness, but from the kind of worry that wakes you up at 3 a.m. and doesn't let you fall back under. He wasn't bad looking, not that it mattered much in Grey Ridge. He was the kind of man people trusted instinctively without knowing why, probably because he didn't try to be anything he wasn't. He said what he meant. He showed up when he said he would. He'd built a decent reputation doing honest work, and for most of his life, that had been enough. It wasn't enough anymore. The bank notice had come 6 weeks ago. $47,000 in outstanding debt. The remainder of a loan his father had taken out to modernize the shop's equipment. Money spent before the old man's health had started going sideways. The bank had been tolerant during Roy's illness. They'd been somewhat tolerant during the months after the funeral. But the third notice had arrived in a red envelope, which Caleb understood to be the bank's particular way of saying that their patience had reached its terminal point. He had 11 days left. 11 days to come up with $47,000, or Turner's Auto would belong to a financial institution that had never once changed a brake pad in its entire corporate existence. He'd called everyone he could think of. Old customers who might know investors. His father's lodge brother, a man named Hank who had more opinions than capital. An old high school friend who worked in finance up in Burlington, who'd been genuinely sympathetic but hadn't been able to do anything practical. He'd even, in a moment of desperation he wasn't proud of, looked into small business grants, which turned out to require approximately 9 months of paperwork and a level of optimism he no longer had in reserve. So when Gerald Foss showed up with that briefcase and that folder and that number at the bottom of the page, Caleb didn't say yes. But he didn't say no either. He crossed his arms and said, "Talk." Foss talked. The story came out in careful, measured installments, the way a lawyer tells you something when he's been trained to give you only what you need and nothing that might lead to questions he doesn't want to answer. Serena Whitmore, 29 years old, sole heir to the Whitmore Group, a conglomerate that held real estate, biotech interests, and a chain of infrastructure firms that built roads and bridges in 7 states. Her father, Edmund Whitmore, had died 14 months ago of a sudden cardiac event, the kind that killed people who by all outward appearances were perfectly healthy. Serena had inherited everything. And then, 6 weeks after the funeral, She had collapsed in her home from what attending physicians described as a catastrophic neurological event, origin undetermined. She had been in a medically managed coma ever since. Managed, Caleb repeated. That's an interesting word. She requires around-the-clock medical attention, Foss said, without taking the bait. She's stable. Her prognosis is cautiously optimistic. And she needs a husband because… Foss opened a second folder. This one had a lot more paper in it. Edmund Whitmore's estate was structured around very specific language in his trust documents. Language that was drafted, frankly, with the expectation that Serena would be married before he died. She wasn't. Now, with her incapacitated, certain administrative and voting rights within the Whitmore group are in a state of legal limbo. A legal spouse, even one whose marriage postdates her incapacitation, provides a mechanism under Vermont state law for those rights to be properly administered during her recovery period. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. So you want someone to sign papers and sit in a chair and push buttons on behalf of a woman who's unconscious? Roughly speaking. And you came to me. You were identified as an appropriate candidate. An appropriate… Caleb stopped. He pulled a rag from his pocket and wiped a streak of grease from his hand, mostly because he needed something to do with his fingers. That's a hell of a thing to say about a man you've never met. We've done our research, Mr. Turner. You have no criminal history, no significant assets that would create a conflict of interest. You're respected in your community. You are, for our purposes, uncomplicated. Caleb appreciated the honesty, at least. There was something almost refreshing about being told to your face that you were uncomplicated. And the money. $200,000 upon signing. The remainder of your father's business debt retired as part of the arrangement. Ongoing monthly compensation for the duration of Serena's recovery period. When she wakes, and medical consensus is that she will wake, the terms of the arrangement will be reviewed and you will be fairly compensated for the transition. $200,000. The shop debt cleared. Monthly income. For marrying a woman who wouldn't even know he was there. Caleb had stood there for almost a full minute without saying anything. Out on the street, a dog barked twice and then stopped. Someone somewhere was mowing a lawn. The world was doing its ordinary Wednesday things, completely indifferent to the fact that Caleb Turner was standing in his dead father's garage trying to decide whether the thing he was being offered was a lifeline or a trap. I want to see her first, he said. Foss had paused, almost imperceptibly. That's unusual. I don't care what's usual. I want to see her before I agree to anything. Another pause. Then Foss closed his folder. I'll arrange a visit. The Whitmore estate sat 12 miles outside of Gray Ridge on a property that had once been a working farm before the money had made it into something else entirely. The main house was Georgian Revival, built in the 1920s. 4 stories of cream-colored limestone with a long gravel drive lined by trees that had been there longer than the house. It was the kind of property that didn't apologize for itself. It didn't have to. Caleb drove his truck up this gravel drive on a Thursday afternoon and felt the particular social discomfort of a man who knows exactly what he looks like in a setting that wasn't built for him. His truck had 190,000 miles on it and a rust patch above the rear passenger wheel well that he kept meaning to address. He parked it between a black Mercedes and a Range Rover and let the engine tick for a moment before getting out. A woman met him at the door. Late 40s, lean, dressed in navy with the kind of posture you either had from birth or paid for. She had a face that might have been pretty once and had settled into something sharper over the years. She introduced herself as Marguerite Whitmore, Serena's aunt by way of her father's brother. Mr. Turner, she said, in a tone that managed to be simultaneously cordial and dismissive. Gerald tells me you wanted to meet Serena before agreeing. I think that shows character. She said the word character the way some people say the word quaint. Just seemed like the right thing to do, Caleb said. She led him through the house, which was exactly what he'd expected, and nothing like home. High ceilings, Persian rugs, artwork that probably had names, a staircase that split at the landing, staff who moved through the hallways with practiced invisibility. He noted things the way he always did, an old habit, the mechanic's instinct to look at everything and figure out how it worked. Serena Whitmore's room was on the second floor, east wing, with tall windows that faced a garden that was clearly tended by someone who knew what they were doing. The The room itself was clean, quiet, and clinical in ways that overlay the original furnishings without quite erasing them. A hospital bed where a four-poster had presumably once stood, equipment along the walls, a drip line, a monitor that beeped softly at intervals, and in the bed, a young woman who looked, from the doorway, like she was simply asleep. Caleb stood there for a moment, then walked closer. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Someone diminished, maybe. The way the very sick sometimes look diminished, as if the illness has been consuming them from the inside. But Serena Whitmore didn't look that way. She was pale, yes, and there was a stillness to her that was different from ordinary sleep, a quality of absence that was hard to name precisely. But she had a face that suggested a person who was, in some essential and stubbornly intact way, still there. He noticed her hands first, long fingers, a small callus on her right index finger that you'd get from writing a lot, or maybe from a specific grip on something, a hospital bracelet on her left wrist. Then he saw what was beneath it, a bruise. Not fresh, faded to a yellow-green at its edges, the way bruises look when they're a week or more old. But the position of it was wrong. It wasn't the kind of bruise you got from a blood draw or an IV insertion. It was wider, more irregular, the kind of mark a grip might leave. Caleb straightened up and looked at the IV line. The bag hanging above her was standard saline solution, or at least it had a standard saline label on it. He noted the brand, the lot number, the way it had been positioned. He noted that the IV stand had been moved recently. There was a faint indentation in the carpet where it had previously stood, a few inches from where it was now. He looked around the room without appearing to look around the room, which was a skill he hadn't known he'd developed until he was already using it. And on the small table beside the bed, half hidden beneath a folded handkerchief, was a small black device about the size of a book of matches, with a tiny pinhole lens on one face. A recording device, pointed at the bed. Caleb stood there with his hands in his pockets and kept his face very still. Behind him, Marguerite Whitmore said, "She looks peaceful, doesn't she? We take very good care of her. Dr. Reeve visits every day. She has everything she needs." "She's lucky to have family looking out for her," Caleb said, and his voice came out exactly the way he needed it to. Flat, agreeable, giving nothing away. He didn't decide on the drive home. He sat in the driveway of his rented house for a while after he got back, engine off, radio off, just sitting in the dark with the window down, listening to the frogs down by the creek. He thought about his father. Roy Turner had been a practical man in the way that men of his generation sometimes were, not unfeeling, but unwilling to let feeling override reason. He'd had a phrase he used when Caleb was young and some situation seemed impossible from the outside. Just stay in the room and keep your eyes open. He hadn't meant it metaphorically. He'd meant that most things, if you just stayed present long enough and paid attention, eventually revealed themselves. Caleb thought about the bruise on Serena Whitmore's wrist, the IV bag, the recording device under the handkerchief. He thought about the way Marguerite Whitmore had said we take very good care of her, and the way she'd been watching him the entire time he was in that room. He thought about the $47,000 and the 11 days. He went inside and called Gerald Foss. "I'll do it," he said. Foss sounded relieved in a way that was only slightly too eager. "Excellent. We can proceed with the paperwork immediately. The ceremony will be private, naturally. Just witnesses, a justice of the peace. Tomorrow, if you're available." "Tomorrow," Caleb agreed. He didn't sleep much that night. Not from excitement, not from nerves exactly. From the particular wakefulness that comes when something in your gut is telling you that you're about to step into something bigger than what you can currently see. The wedding was the strangest morning of Caleb Turner's 38 years, and he'd had some strange mornings. It took place in a sitting room on the ground floor of the Whitmore estate, with a justice of the peace named Henderson who had kind eyes and the slightly apologetic air of a man who performed unconventional legal ceremonies more often than he let on. There were 4 witnesses: Gerald Foss, Marguerite Whitmore, a woman introduced only as company counsel, and a man named Dorian Voss who was there in some capacity that was never fully explained to Caleb. Dorian was mid-30s, handsome in the aggressive way of men who spend time making sure of it, and he looked at Caleb with a particular expression that Caleb couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't hostility exactly, but there was something territorial in it, something that reminded Caleb of the way a dog looks at a stranger in his yard. Serena Whitmore was brought down in her bed, which had been fitted with portable monitoring equipment for the occasion. She lay exactly as she had the day before, still and pale, her hands folded across the blanket. Henderson conducted the ceremony with efficient dignity, which Caleb respected. He said the words he was supposed to say, signed the documents he was supposed to sign, and accepted a plain gold band that had clearly been purchased within the last 24 hours. He slid it onto the appropriate finger. Someone did the same for Serena, her hand lifted briefly and then returned to the blanket. And then it was done. Caleb was, legally, the husband of Serena Whitmore. He stood in the sitting room afterward while people exchanged murmured words around him and thought about what his father would have said about all of this. Probably something dry and brief. Probably something that would have made him laugh despite himself. Then Dorian Voss materialized beside him, close enough that it was slightly more than coincidental. "She and I were going to be married," Dorian said, his voice casual in the studied way of someone who'd practiced the casual. "Before all this happened, the family felt it was important you knew that." "I appreciate you telling me," Caleb said. "She wouldn't have wanted this." A pause. "No offense intended." "None taken," Caleb said, which was true. He was more interested in the fact that Dorian's jaw had tightened very slightly after saying wouldn't have wanted, as if the tense had been chosen deliberately. Not wouldn't want, wouldn't have wanted, as if she weren't expected to have opinions in the future. "I was given a room in the East Wing, close to Serena's. That arrangement had been presented to him as a courtesy, easier access for any administrative matters requiring the signature of a present spouse. He accepted it without comment and spent the first evening unpacking a single duffel bag into a dresser that had probably cost more than his monthly rent. He did not unpack right away. He sat on the edge of the bed and thought. The bruise, the IV bag, the recording device. He ran it through his head carefully, the way he worked through a diagnostic on a vehicle he didn't fully understand yet. You didn't throw parts at an engine problem until you'd taken the time to listen to it first. You listened, you observed, you formed a theory, and then, only then, you tested the theory carefully so as not to break anything that was still working. He went to Serena's room at 11 o'clock that night. He told himself he was checking on her, which was technically true. She looked exactly the same as she had every other time he'd seen her, still. Pale. The monitor kept its steady, soft tempo. The room smelled faintly of lavender and antiseptic. He walked to the IV stand first. The bag from the afternoon had been replaced. Expected, routine. But there was something slightly off about the angle of the line, the way it fed into the junction. He didn't touch it. He just looked. Then he went to the small table. The handkerchief was there. He lifted a corner. The recording device was gone. So someone checked it regularly. Or had noticed him noticing it. Either possibility was informative. He stood by the window for a while and looked out at the garden, which was a dark mass of shapes in the moonlight, and thought about what Roy Turner would have said. "Stay in the room," the old man would have told him. "Keep your eyes open." He looked back at the woman in the bed. Serena Whitmore, 29 years old, sole heir to an empire she didn't currently know she owned, lying in a house full of people who were being paid to care for her, and may or may not have been doing anything of the kind. "I don't know what's going on here yet," he said quietly, to the room, to her, to no one in particular. "But I'm going to figure it out." The monitor beeped. The curtains stirred faintly at the window's edge. He went back to his room and lay on the bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling, listening to the big house settle around him. And somewhere in the machinery of everything he'd seen and heard and noticed over the past 2 days, something was beginning to take shape. Not a conclusion yet, barely even a theory. Just the first suggestion of a pattern. The kind of pattern you only saw if you stayed in the room long enough. This is a completely fictional cinematic story created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely fictional. The first week inside the Whitmore estate taught Caleb more than he'd learned in the previous 6 months of his life, and none of it was the kind of knowledge you could use in polite conversation. He learned, for instance, that the house ran on a schedule so precise it felt engineered rather than habitual. Breakfast service began at 7:15. Dr. Reeve arrived between 9 and 9:30 every morning, stayed approximately 40 minutes, and left through the side entrance rather than the front, a detail that struck Caleb as odd until he realized the side entrance wasn't covered by the security camera mounted above the main door. Marguerite Whitmore held what she called her morning review in the East Parlor at 10, which appeared to be less a household management meeting and more a daily briefing where she received reports from staff and issued instructions that were framed as suggestions, but clearly weren't. Dorian Voss came and went with the loose, proprietary ease of someone who believed he had a permanent right to be wherever he happened to be standing. Caleb watched all of it. He said very little. He fixed things. That last part had started accidentally. On his third morning, he'd noticed that the service door between the kitchen and the garden corridor had a hinge that was pulling away from the frame. The kind of slow structural failure that happens when a door has been hung slightly wrong for years, and nobody with the right knowledge has ever looked at it. He'd mentioned it to a young kitchen staffer named Petra, who'd looked at him with the cautious expression of someone who'd learned not to involve herself in things above her pay grade. "I can fix it," he said, "if there are tools somewhere." There was a maintenance room off the basement corridor. He found what he needed, fixed the hinge in 20 minutes, and didn't make a production of it. But Petra had seen him do it, and the next morning she'd left a cup of coffee on the workbench beside the maintenance room with a small note that just said thank you. No name, as if putting her name on it would have been too much of a commitment. That was how it started. Small things. A stuck drawer in the butler's pantry, a window in the upstairs library that had been painted shut so long no one remembered it was supposed to open. A section of fencing in the east garden that had been leaning at an angle for what looked like the better part of 2 seasons. He fixed them quietly, without announcement, and each time the repair was noticed by someone. A housekeeper named Dolores, who had worked at the estate for over 20 years, a groundskeeper named Walt, who communicated primarily in monosyllables, but whose small nod of acknowledgement felt, for reasons Caleb couldn't fully articulate, like something worth earning. It wasn't strategy exactly, or it hadn't started as strategy. He fixed things because fixing things was what he did, and because standing around doing nothing made him restless in a way that made it hard to think clearly. But it turned out that being the person who fixed things without being asked and without expecting credit was a surprisingly powerful social position in a household where almost everyone else was either leveraging their access or protecting their territory. People started talking to him. Not about anything significant at first. Petra told him about a leak in the staff bathroom that had been reported 3 times to Marguerite's personal assistant and ignored 3 times. Dolores mentioned, without being asked, that Dr. Reeve had changed in the past year, that he used to spend more time with Serena, used to consult the previous medical team more regularly, and that something had shifted in the way he handled her case around the time Marguerite had taken over the household management. Walt said almost nothing about anything, but one afternoon while they were both working near the East Garden, he stopped, looked at the house, and said quietly, "Miss Serena used to come out here every Saturday morning. Before." And then he'd gone back to what he was doing, and that had been the whole conversation, but it sat in Caleb's chest in a way that took him a while to identify as anger. He went to Serena's room every evening. He didn't have a formal reason. His presence on the estate was as her husband, which technically gave him access, and he exercised that access with a consistency that he knew was being tracked and a frequency that he knew made certain people uncomfortable. He didn't try to hide it. He simply went, sat with her for a while, and left. If anyone wanted to question it, they hadn't done so yet. He talked to her sometimes. Nothing consequential. He'd catch himself describing something mundane from the day because the room was very quiet, and the silence had a quality he didn't like. He told her about the hinge on the service door. He told her that her East Garden was well maintained, that whoever was doing it knew what they were doing with the roses. He told her that her house was full of people who were very busy keeping up appearances, and that he was still trying to figure out exactly what the appearances were covering. He didn't know if she could hear any of it. He suspected she couldn't. But he did it anyway, mostly because it felt more honest than silence. On the 9th night, he noticed that her left hand had moved. It was a small thing. Her fingers had been flat against the blanket the previous evening, and now the hand was turned slightly, the fingers loosely curled. He might have attributed it to normal staff repositioning, the way patients in long-term care were turned and adjusted to prevent pressure injuries. But Dolores had mentioned, casually and without realizing she was telling him something important, that Serena's overnight positioning was always managed by the night nurse and always followed the same protocol. Hands flat, arms at the sides. He sat down in the chair beside the bed and looked at her hand for a while. Then he did something impulsive, which was not normally in his nature. He reached out and rested his own hand very gently over hers. He wasn't sure what he expected. Nothing, probably. Her fingers moved. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in movies, where the comatose person grabs your hand with sudden, awakened strength. Just a small, slow curl of fingers, so slight he might have convinced himself it was involuntary muscle movement if it hadn't happened twice, with a few seconds between each one, in the specific pattern of something intentional trying to express itself through a body that wasn't fully cooperating. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just kept his hand exactly where it was and waited. And then, after about a minute, it stopped. He stayed for another hour after that, watching her face, watching the monitor, watching her hand. Nothing else happened. Eventually, he went back to his room, lay down on top of the covers, and stared at the ceiling with his heart beating in a way that he recognized as something more than the mechanical response to an unexpected event. She was in there. He didn't know how much, didn't know how close to the surface, but she was in there. Well, the medication change happened on the 11th night. He'd been keeping an eye on the IV supplies, not in any systematic way that would have been noticed, just maintaining the kind of ambient awareness he'd developed for anything that was routine at the estate. The saline bags were delivered from a medical supply company twice weekly, in sealed boxes that were signed for by whoever was on duty at the service entrance. The delivery log was kept in the medical supply closet off the second-floor corridor, a room that was kept locked, but whose lock was, by Caleb's professional assessment, a mid-grade residential deadbolt that had no business being on a door it was being asked to secure. He hadn't opened the lock. He hadn't needed to. Dolores, who held the housekeeping master key set, had asked him on the 10th day if he could take a look at a light fixture in that corridor that had been flickering for weeks. He'd fixed the fixture in 8 minutes, during which time he'd had a clear sightline to the shelf inside the supply closet that Dolores had left open while she retrieved fresh linens from the adjacent storage room. The delivery log was right there on the shelf. He hadn't touched it, but he'd read the last 3 entries in the time it took to tighten 2 screws. The saline deliveries were from a company called Meridian Medical Supply, which he recognized as a legitimate regional vendor. But the third item on the most recent delivery receipt, listed as a supplemental compounding order, came from a different source entirely, a company called Halsit Bioprep, which he'd never heard of and which wasn't listed on any of the visible medical documentation in Serena's room. He'd thought about that for 2 days before he understood what it might mean. He started arriving at Serena's room earlier in the evening, before the night nurse came on duty. He made it look like nothing, brought a book he wasn't reading, sat in the chair by the window, left before 10, so there was no reason for anyone to think he was timing anything. But on the 13th night, he was still there when the night nurse arrived to do the medication check, and he saw what he hadn't been positioned to see before. The nurse, a woman in her 40s named Bright, who wore her professional composure like armor, did the standard checks first. Vitals, positioning, drip rate, all of it routine and by the book. But then she opened the small refrigerated cabinet beside the monitoring station, the one Caleb had assumed contained standard backup supplies, and removed a secondary bag that was smaller than the saline bag and had a hand-labeled secondary port attachment. She didn't hang it from the IV stand. She attached it to a secondary injection port on the existing line. A port Caleb hadn't known was there, positioned on the underside of the line junction where it wouldn't be immediately visible from the doorway. And she did it without logging anything, without making any notation in the bedside chart, without any record at all, as far as Caleb could see. Then she noticed him watching. The silence in the room expanded for about 3 seconds, which felt much longer. "I didn't realize you were still here, Mr. Turner," Bright said. "Fell asleep in the chair," he said. "Just woke up." She looked at him with eyes that were doing a lot of calculation behind a professionally neutral expression. "You should get some rest. Your own rest, I mean. I'll be with her all night." "Right," he said. "Sorry." He stood, took his book, said goodnight, and left the room at the pace of someone who was tired and slightly disoriented and had no particular reason to be anywhere. In his own room, he sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and thought very hard. A secondary medication. Administered at night through a hidden port with no logging, sourced from a company that wasn't on any visible treatment documentation. in a patient who was supposed to be in a spontaneously induced coma recovering from a neurological event. What kind of medication did you give someone secretly at night if you were genuinely trying to help them recover? You didn't. That was the answer. You didn't. If you were trying to keep someone under, though, if you needed a body that breathed and registered a pulse but stayed exactly where it was and didn't inconvenience anyone by waking up, that was a different calculation entirely. He thought about Serena's fingers moving against his hand, that small, effortful curl, her body fighting something or trying to. He thought about Dorian Voss's jaw tightening when he'd said, "wouldn't have wanted." He thought about Marguerite Whitmore's voice when she said we take very good care of her, and the way her eyes had moved to the small table by the bed, just for a fraction of a second, and then away. He found Walt the next morning before the house was fully awake, out by the equipment shed at the edge of the property, running a line trimmer along the fence edge with the methodical patience of a man who'd been doing the same task for so many years that his body had essentially automated it. Caleb helped him with the section near the gate without being asked. Walt acknowledged this by handing him a second pair of work gloves without comment. They worked in silence for about 20 minutes. Caleb had learned that Walt's silence wasn't unfriendly. It was just the natural habitat of a man who had no particular interest in words that didn't mean anything. When he spoke, it was because he had something to say. "Dolores told me you fixed the upstairs light," Walt said eventually, without looking up from the trimmer. "Just a loose wire." Walt nodded. Another silence. Then, "Good man, Roy Turner. Knew him a little. Used to bring his truck out here for estate work sometimes, when they needed the extra hands. 20 years ago, maybe." Caleb stopped. "You knew my father?" "Not well. But I knew what kind of man he was. Which is why when they told me who they were bringing in to marry Miss Serena, I thought—" Walt paused, found the end of his sentence, and decided to let it drop. "Anyway," Caleb let that sit for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Dr. Reeve, how long has he been her physician?" Walt considered this. "Couple years, maybe. She had her own doctor before, woman named Calloway from the medical center in Burlington. Real sharp. Used to come out here and actually spend time with Miss Serena, not just run through a checklist. Then after Mr. Edmund passed, Ms. Marguerite took over the household arrangements and Calloway stopped coming." "Stopped or was stopped?" Walt looked at him then, a long, level look. "That," he said, "is the right question." He didn't say anything else about it, but before they parted ways, he put his hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder, the kind of gesture that costs something from a man who doesn't make them often, and went back to his work. Caleb had been at the estate for just over 2 weeks when Serena Whitmore woke up the first time. He almost missed it. He'd arrived at her room later than usual that evening, held up by a phone call from Gerald Foss regarding some administrative matter he half listened to and immediately forgot. It was close to 9 when he pushed open the door and stepped inside. Serena's eyes were open, not in the vague, unfocused way that sometimes happened with coma patients due to involuntary muscle activity. He'd read enough in the past 2 weeks to know the difference. Her eyes were open, and they were tracking, moving in small, deliberate arcs across the ceiling. And then, as he stepped into the room, they moved to him. He stood very still. The expression on her face was the most frightening thing he'd seen in a long time. Not fear exactly, more like the look of someone who has surfaced suddenly into cold water and cannot yet determine which direction is up. Disorientation so total it had its own weight. But underneath it, fighting up through it, was something more deliberate, something that was trying very hard to function. Her lips moved before sound came. He crossed to the bed quickly and crouched beside it so he was at her level. "Hey," he said, and it came out quiet and steady, which he was grateful for. "Hey, you're okay. Don't try to sit up, just the—" She stopped. Her voice was wrecked from disuse, barely above a breath. She swallowed with visible effort. "The medicine." He was very quiet for a moment. "What about the medicine?" Her eyes found his with an effort that seemed to cost her something real. "Don't let them—" Another swallow. Her hand found the edge of the blanket and gripped it. "They change it, at night. Don't let—" She stopped as suddenly as she'd started. Her eyes lost their focus, and then found it again, and then lost it, and Caleb watched the consciousness that had briefly surfaced begin to pull back down, like something being dragged under by a current that was stronger than it was. "Serena," he said. "Serena, look at me." Her eyes came back to him for just a moment. 1 second, maybe two. And in that second, there was something in her face that wasn't confusion anymore. It was recognition of a sort, or the beginning of it, or the specific look of someone deciding in real time whether a stranger can be trusted. He held the eye contact and tried to make his face say what he meant it to say. "I know. I'm already looking." Then she was under again, eyes closing, breathing, shifting back into the slow, regular rhythm of before. The hand on the blanket slowly relaxed. Caleb stayed crouched beside the bed for a long time after that, not moving, the room very quiet around him, the monitor beeping its steady, indifferent tempo. She'd come up out of whatever they were putting her under long enough to warn him about the exact thing he'd already started to suspect, which meant one of two things. Either she'd been aware for longer than anyone understood, or she'd been fighting her way toward consciousness, specifically because some part of her knew what was being done to her and needed to say it out loud to someone, anyone, before she was pulled back down. Either possibility made him feel sick in a way that had nothing to do with himself. He thought about the secondary bag and the hidden port and the unmarked company name in the delivery log. He thought about Nurse Bright's carefully neutral face when she'd caught him watching. He thought about Marguerite Whitmore directing her daily briefings from the East Parlor with the precise managing energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this situation to fall into her hands, a crisis that positioned her at the center of the Whitmore world, making all the decisions, controlling all the access, holding all the information in a household that deferred to her because there was no one else to defer to. He stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the dark garden. He needed to be careful. Being careful was not the same as being slow. He understood that now. Being careful meant knowing exactly which moves to make and in what order, and not making the ones that would alert the wrong people before he had enough in hand to matter. It was the same logic as diagnosing an engine you didn't want to spook into seizing before you could get it onto the lift. You worked around the edges first. You gathered your information. You didn't reach for the parts until you understood what you were dealing with. He went back to his room and wrote down everything he'd seen and heard over the past 2 weeks in a small notebook he'd bought at a gas station on his last permitted trip to town. Names, dates, details. The secondary medication, the hidden port, the unlisted vendor, Nurse Bright, Marguerite's daily briefings, Walt's comment about Dr. Calloway, Dorian's tense jaw and the specific word he'd chosen. All of it. Then he put the notebook in the hollow space inside the door panel of his truck where no one would think to look, and he went to sleep. Serena Whitmore had been in that house, in that bed, fighting her way up through whatever they were keeping her down with, long enough to be terrified and still alert enough to warn the first person who seemed like they might actually listen. Caleb was going to make sure she hadn't wasted the effort. This is a completely fictional cinematic story created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely fictional. Part 3. The notebook and the truck door panel wasn't enough, and Caleb knew it. Observations weren't evidence. A bruise and a hidden medication port and an unlisted vendor on a delivery receipt were things that could be explained away by someone with a good attorney, and everyone in the Whitmore orbit, as far as Caleb could tell, had access to very good attorneys. What he had was a picture of something wrong. What he needed was proof of what the wrong thing actually was, specific enough and documented enough that it couldn't be quietly absorbed and dismissed. He also needed time, and he was becoming increasingly aware that time was the resource in shortest supply. Serena had surfaced twice more in the 3 days following that first conscious moment. Both times brief, both times when the overnight medication cycle was at its lowest point. In the early morning, around 4 or 5, when whatever they were giving her through the hidden port had metabolized enough to loosen its grip slightly. He'd taken to sleeping lightly and setting a quiet alarm, slipping down the corridor in the dark, and sitting with her in the hour before the house started waking up. The second time, she'd managed 6 or 7 words before going under again. She'd looked at him with those exhausted, fighting eyes and said, "There's a car. My father's. The garage." And then she'd lost it, dropped back into the depths, and he'd sat there in the gray pre-dawn light trying to figure out what a car had to do with any of this. The third time, she'd been more agitated. Her hands had moved against the blanket with a restlessness that was new. And when her eyes opened, they'd been unfocused for longer before finding him, as if whatever they were giving her was being increased. Caleb, she'd said, using his name for the first time, which meant she'd been conscious enough at some point to learn it. Don't trust. And then she'd stopped, her face tightening with the specific frustration of someone whose body is failing to cooperate with what their mind is trying to do. The papers. My father kept the car. He always... Her eyes had lost their focus again. Blue. It's blue. After the third time, he'd moved the alarm back to 3 a.m. because someone was clearly adjusting the dosage, and whatever window existed was getting narrower. The fourth time she came up, 4 nights later, she didn't speak in fragments. She looked at him and said, in a voice that was still damaged from disuse, but steadier than it had any right to be, Edmund Whitmore's 1963 Aston Martin. It's in the private garage behind the East groundskeeper's cottage. There's a leather satchel behind the rear seat panel. He told me, before he died, he told me that if anything ever happened... She stopped, breathed carefully, the way someone breathes when they're managing pain. He said everything I'd need was in the car. What did he think was going to happen? Caleb said. Her jaw tightened. He knew someone was stealing from the company. He'd found evidence. He was going to take it to the investigators after the new year. He died in November. Caleb was quiet for a moment, feeling the shape of that settle into everything else he already knew. Who knew he'd found the evidence? Her eyes were heavy, but she held them open by what seemed like pure stubbornness. His board chair, his CFO, Marguerite. She swallowed. Dorian. And 6 weeks after the funeral, you had a neurological event. She didn't say anything to that. She didn't have to. He leaned forward slightly. How long have you been able to hear things? Months, she said. On and off? It comes and goes? The medication? She stopped and made a small, exhausted sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I figured out the cycle. I've been trying to come up for long enough to do something, and I just... She blinked, and her eyes were going glassy again at the edges. They can't know you know. If they think you know, they'll... I know, he said. Go back under. I'll find the car. She looked at him for another second with that expression he was starting to recognize, the one that was measuring him, still, after everything, because trusting a stranger you'd woken up married to was not something anyone did easily, regardless of circumstance. Whatever she found in his face seemed to be enough for the moment. Her eyes closed. He sat there until her breathing had settled back into its regular rhythm. Then he went and found Walt. Walt didn't ask why Caleb wanted to see the private garage before sunrise. He just looked at him for a long, flat moment in the pre-dawn gray of the equipment shed, and then said, You know about the car? Just found out, Caleb said. I've been wondering when that was going to happen. Walt pulled his work jacket off a hook and put it on. Come on, then. The private garage was a converted carriage house set back behind the East groundskeeper's cottage, separated from the main property flow by a hedgerow and a section of the stone boundary wall that created a natural blind spot from the house's primary sightlines. Walt had a key. He'd been maintaining Edmund Whitmore's personal vehicles for 11 years, a responsibility that had apparently survived the transition of household management to Marguerite, possibly because Marguerite had never shown any interest in old cars and hadn't thought to revoke the access. Inside the garage, under a fitted gray cover, sat the 1963 Aston Martin DB5. In a blue so dark it was almost black, which was the only shade that color came in on that model in that year. Caleb pulled the cover back from the rear quarter and opened the rear door, which swung with the heavy, precise movement of a car that had been exceptionally well maintained. He reached behind the rear seat panel, found the seam, applied the right pressure in the right place, the kind of thing you learned from years of pulling apart car interiors for legitimate reasons. And the panel released. The leather satchel was there. It was old, the leather worn at the corners, the brass clasp tarnished but functional. He opened it on the hood of the car, in the thin morning light coming through the high garage windows, with Walt standing a few feet back and not looking over his shoulder, giving him room. Inside, a collection of USB drives, 3 of them, labeled in a neat, precise hand with dates spanning roughly 2 years. A printed ledger, 40 or 50 pages, dense with account numbers and transaction records, and figures that ran into 8 and 9 digits. A separate folder containing what appeared to be corporate filing documents, shell company registrations, the kind that existed to obscure the movement of money between entities that were nominally unrelated. And at the bottom, a sealed envelope with Serena's name on it, in the same neat handwriting as the drive labels. Caleb didn't open the envelope. He photographed everything else with his phone, quickly and methodically, checking each page of the ledger and each corporate filing. Then he repacked the satchel exactly as he'd found it, replaced it behind the panel, pressed the panel back into position, and put the cover back on the car. He stood up and looked at Walt. "If anyone asks," Walt said, already ahead of him, "I came out early to check the tire pressure on the Bentley, and you came with me because you were having trouble sleeping." "That works," Caleb said. Walt nodded and pulled the garage door shut behind them without another word. The photographs on his phone were a start, but raw photographs of financial documents weren't the same as having the documents themselves, and Caleb understood enough about how these things worked to know that the chain of custody mattered. What Edmund Whitmore had built was a physical record, primary source material with specific metadata, dated drives, original ledger pages. That was what investigators would need. That was what would make this stick, rather than dissolve into a legal dispute about digital authenticity and document provenance. He needed to get that satchel out of the garage without triggering whatever surveillance existed on the property. And he needed to do it without Serena waking up under circumstances that gave the wrong people enough warning to move the evidence, clean the medical record, or do something worse. He spent 2 days thinking about it while he went about the estate doing the ordinary things that had become his cover, fixing a section of the kitchen exhaust vent that had been rattling for months, helping Dolores rearrange the storage room off the second-floor corridor, spending time with Serena in the evenings in the way that he always did, talking to her quietly about nothing important while his mind was somewhere else entirely. On the evening of the second day, he found something he hadn't been looking for. He'd been in the library, a room he'd started spending time in partly because it had decent armchairs, and partly because the estate's Wi-Fi signal was strongest there, which he used for research on his phone after hours. He'd been reading through a forensic accounting overview he'd found online, trying to make sure he understood what he was looking at in the ledger photographs, when he noticed the framed photographs on the library's south wall. Estate photographs, the kind that hung in old money houses to document the family's relationship with time and property. They went back decades. He'd glanced at them before without paying close attention. He paid attention now. There was a photograph from what looked like the late 1990s, a company event of some kind, a ribbon cutting or a groundbreaking, the kind of ceremonial moment that got professionally documented. Edmund Whitmore was there, younger, smiling the smile of a man who'd built something and was pleased about it. Beside him, a group of men in suits, most of whom Caleb didn't recognize, one of whom he did. Gerald Foss. 20-something years younger, but the same thin face, the same way of holding himself slightly apart from the people around him, as if proximity was a resource he managed carefully. He was standing in the second row, slightly to the left of center, and he was looking directly at the camera with the expression of a man who expected to be somewhere more central before too long. Caleb looked at that photograph for a long time. Then he went back to the armchair and sat down and thought about the sequence of events with fresh eyes. Foss had come to him with the marriage proposal. Foss had identified him as an appropriate candidate. Foss had described Caleb's situation, the debt, the shop, the specific financial pressure, with the kind of precise knowledge you only had if you'd been paying attention to someone for a reason. I thought about something Foss had said, almost offhandedly, during that first conversation in the garage. You were identified as an appropriate candidate. He hadn't asked who had done the identifying. He'd been too focused on the number at the bottom of the page. He picked up his phone and searched Halset Bioprep, the unlisted vendor from the medical supply delivery log. The company had a minimal web presence, a basic site with no meaningful information, a registered address in a state known for permissive corporate registration, and a list of officers that included, buried in the third row of the registered agent documentation, he eventually found in a state database, a name, a holding company called GF Administrative Solutions, Gerald Foss's initials. Caleb set the phone down on the arm of the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Foss wasn't just the attorney who'd brought him the proposal. Foss was the man who was supplying the medication that was keeping Serena unconscious, which meant Foss knew exactly what was in those bags, which meant the entire marriage arrangement, the proposal, the financial pressure that had made Caleb receptive to it, the framing of it as a legal administrative necessity. had been constructed around a need that only existed because someone was already committing a crime. And Caleb's financial ruin hadn't been accidental. He'd assumed it was just bad timing, bad luck, the ordinary kind of slow drowning that happened to small businesses when the wrong things went wrong at the wrong time. But he thought about it now with different questions in mind. The bank loan his father had taken out had been arranged through a brokerage firm that had come recommended by one of Roy's lodge brothers, a man named Hank, who, when Caleb had called him in desperation 2 months ago, had been oddly vague about how he'd come to know the firm in the first place. The interest rate on the loan had been aggressive in a way the small print had obscured. The timeline of the loan's acceleration, the aggressive demand schedule, the red envelope arriving at exactly the moment when Caleb had no options left, had a pattern to it that, now that he was looking at it through the lens of what he knew, looked less like banking procedure and more like a designed conclusion. They had needed a specific kind of man, someone with no assets, no power, no connections to anyone who could complicate things. Someone with enough financial desperation to say yes to an unusual proposal without asking the questions a more comfortable man would have asked. Someone with a reputation clean enough to be legally credible as a spouse, but isolated enough to be managed. They had found him, and then, when circumstances hadn't been quite desperate enough, they had made them desperate. He sat with that for a while. There was an emotion in it that wanted to be rage, and he let himself feel it briefly because suppressing it completely wasn't useful. It had a way of finding structural cracks to leak out through at inconvenient moments. But rage, at this particular moment, was a luxury he couldn't spend. He needed to stay clear. The next morning, he called an attorney. Not Foss. Not anyone connected to the Whitmore estate or the Whitmore group or any of the interlocking structures he'd been mapping in his notebook over the past 3 weeks. He called a woman named Sandra Okafor who practiced out of Burlington and whose name he'd gotten from an online search of attorneys specializing in corporate fraud and fiduciary violations. The kind of search he conducted on his cellular data, not the estate's Wi-Fi. He drove to Burlington on the pretext of needing parts for a repair he'd volunteered to do on the estate's secondary vehicle, which was technically true. The car did need parts. He'd identified the need legitimately, and having a real errand was better than having no cover. He met Sandra Okafor in a coffee shop near her office and talked for 45 minutes. She was in her early 50s, compact and direct, with the particular quality of attention that belonged to people who listened for a living and had trained themselves not to react visibly to things that surprised them. She let him lay out what he had: the documents, the medication supply chain, the shell company registration, the photograph, the connection to Foss. And when he was done, she sat quietly for a moment and then said, "The medical angle is the most serious immediate issue. That needs to go to a doctor first, not an attorney. How do I get an independent doctor in there without triggering the people who are managing her care? You're her legal spouse." She said it flatly, as a statement of available tool. "You have authority over her medical decisions that supersedes the household management arrangement. Have you exercised that authority at all? No? Then you have a card you haven't played yet." She tapped the table once with one finger. "The issue is timing. If you play it too early, before you have the financial evidence properly secured and documented, they have time to move money and sanitize the medical record. Play it too late, and—" She stopped, and the thing she didn't say sat between them on the table. "I know," he said. "You need the physical evidence out of that garage and into a secure third-party location first. Then you need to trigger the medical review. Then the financial investigation follows from there." She looked at him steadily. "This isn't going to be clean, Mr. Turner. These people have had a long time to build their walls." "I know," he said again. He drove back to Grey Ridge with the parts and spent the afternoon doing the repair and thinking. The walls came down sooner than he'd planned, and not in the order he'd have chosen. On a Thursday evening, 3.5 weeks into his time at the estate, Dorian Voss found him in the library. Dorian had a glass of something amber in his hand and the loose, slightly over-controlled posture of a man who'd had enough to be uninhibited but was working to project otherwise. He came into the library without knocking, a habit the man had that Caleb had noticed before, and filed under things that told you something about someone, and stood in the middle of the room looking at Caleb with an expression that had given up trying to be pleasant. "I want to have an honest conversation," Dorian said. "All right," Caleb said. Dorian sat down in the chair across from him, the movement slightly more deliberate than casual. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone more manageable. He took a slow drink. You move around this house like you're studying it. I fix things, Caleb said. That's what I do. You look at things differently when you're trying to figure out how they work. Dorian's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile. You know what the arrangement was supposed to look like. A credible husband on paper. Someone who'd stay in his lane, collect his money, be grateful. He turned the glass in his hand. You're not staying in your lane. I'm not sure I was told where my lane was. I'm telling you now. The pleasantness was fully gone from his voice. Serena and I were together for 2 years. This company, this family. I understand how it works in ways you never will, regardless of what a piece of paper says about your legal status. When she wakes up, he paused on the phrase, which Caleb noted. When she wakes up, not if, a slip that meant something. She'll need people around her who understand that world, who belong in it. And you're worried I might be one of those people, Caleb said. Dorian looked at him for a long, flat moment. You're a mechanic from a town nobody's heard of. You came here because you needed money. That's the whole story. You're right about most of that, Caleb said. Dorian stood, which meant the conversation was over by his measure. Stay in your lane, Turner. It'll be better for everyone. He left without finishing his drink, which he'd left on the side table. Caleb looked at the glass for a moment and then went back to what he'd been reading. The conversation was a data point. Dorian was rattled, which meant someone had told him Caleb was moving in ways they hadn't anticipated. That meant Caleb's behavior had been reported and discussed at a level above what casual household observation would account for, which meant the surveillance on the estate was more deliberate than he'd known, and that whatever timeline he'd been working with had just shortened. He moved the satchel that night. Walt helped him. They did it at 2 a.m. with the lights off, moving through the property's blind spots in a route Walt knew from 11 years of working the grounds. The gap in the camera coverage between the east garden and the groundskeeper's cottage. The section of the boundary wall where the hedgerow gave enough cover to move a bag without being visible from the house's second-floor windows. Caleb's truck was parked in the staff lot on the property's north side. He put the satchel under the rear bench seat, behind a toolbox that had been there since his father's time. He went back to his room and lay down and didn't sleep. At 6:15 in the morning, Gerald Foss called him. I'm hearing some concerns from the family, Foss said, without preamble and without the paper-dry courtesy he usually deployed. Some questions about your conduct in the household. What kind of questions? Questions about your level of engagement with Serena's medical care. Questions about your whereabouts at unusual hours. A pause that had weight to it. Questions about your use of certain areas of the property. Caleb kept his voice completely neutral. I'm her husband. I check on her. I have trouble sleeping and I walk around. I helped with some maintenance because that's what I do and no one seemed to mind before. I understand, but there are concerns and I want you to know they've been raised at a level that has implications for the arrangement. The word arrangement did a lot of work in that sentence and both of them knew it. Are you telling me something specific, Gerald? Another pause. I'm suggesting it might be time to review whether this arrangement is serving its intended purpose. After he hung up, Caleb sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his phone for a moment. Then he called Sandra Okafor. They're moving to push me out, he said when she answered. How long do you have? I don't know. Days, maybe less. Then we go now, she said. I'll make the call to the medical licensing board this morning to initiate a review of Dr. Reeves' treatment protocol. You exercise your spousal medical authority today and request an independent physician evaluation. I'll have the formal letter to you within the hour. Get the physical evidence to my office today. The evidence goes to your office today, he said, but I'm not leaving the house until I've done what I need to do. There was a brief silence on her end. What do you need to do? He thought about Serena's eyes in the early morning dark, fighting to stay open. The specific quality of effort in her face when she was trying to get words out before the current took her back down. The way she'd used his name the third time, like it had cost her something to learn it, and she wanted to prove she hadn't wasted the effort. I need to make sure she knows the evidence is safe, he said. Before I hand it over. She needs to know that part. Sandra didn't argue with it. Be careful, she said, and hung up. He drove to Burlington that morning, delivered the satchel to Sandra Okafor's office personally, and was back on the estate property by noon. That afternoon, Marguerite Whitmore called him into the East Parlor. She was seated at the writing desk with the careful, composed posture of a woman who had arranged herself deliberately before asking him to enter. The room smelled of fresh flowers and furniture polish. Through the window behind her, the garden was doing its late autumn thing, the remaining color concentrated into the few plants that held it longest. "Sit down, Caleb," she said, using his first name for the first time in the weeks he'd been there, which told him everything about the register of this conversation. He sat. She looked at him with the expression she'd probably been practicing since the night before, sympathetic but firm, the face of someone delivering disappointing news that they nonetheless feel is correct. "I want to be direct with you. We feel that the arrangement has become complicated in ways that aren't in anyone's best interest, including yours. We'd like to offer you a clean exit. The agreed compensation, plus a significant additional sum, in exchange for a clean dissolution and a standard confidentiality agreement." Caleb looked at her. "How significant?" She named a number that was designed to end the conversation immediately. "I appreciate the offer," he said. "I'll need to think about it." Her composure flickered for just a fraction of a second. "Of course. We'd need an answer within the next day or so." "I understand." He stood, which ended the meeting by his measure for once. "I'll let you know." He walked out of the East Parlor and up the stairs to Serena's room and closed the door behind him. It was 3 in the afternoon, and the light through the tall windows was the flat pewter gray of November overcast. She was still, as always, breathing her slow monitored breaths. He sat beside her and leaned close enough that he didn't need to speak loudly. "The satchel is safe," he said. "Your father's documents are with an attorney who's already made contact with the medical licensing board. There's an independent physician coming tomorrow." He paused. "Marguerite just offered me a lot of money to disappear. I told her I'd think about it." He sat back and looked at her face, which was the same as always, and also, to him now, something else. The face of a person he knew the outlines of, without having been given the usual opportunities to know them. "I'm not going to take it," he said. "I want you to know that before anything else happens. Whatever's about to happen, it's not because of the money." The monitor beeped. The November light shifted slightly through the window. Her chest rose and fell. And then, very slowly, her hand moved across the blanket, and her fingers found the edge of his, and she held on with the quiet, deliberate grip of someone who had heard every word. "I was gone from the estate by 7 the next morning. Not by his own choice, or not exactly. He'd known it was coming since the conversation with Marguerite the previous afternoon, had felt the timeline collapsing around him with the specific pressure of a situation that had reached the point where the people in control of it needed to act before they lost that control entirely. What he hadn't anticipated was the method, which turned out to be Gerald Foss arriving at the estate at 6:15 a.m. with 2 men who had the build and the manner of people hired for purposes beyond legal administration, and a document that purported to be a restraining order obtained on the grounds that Caleb Turner had been making unauthorized access to estate financial records and creating an environment of distress for the patient in his care. The document was thin. Sandra Okafor would probably describe it later as an aggressive piece of legal theater with a limited shelf life in front of any actual judge. But a piece of legal theater at 6 in the morning, handed to you by 2 large men in your bedroom doorway, while Gerald Foss stood in the hallway looking at you with the expression of someone who has finally been allowed to stop pretending, was still a piece of legal theater you had to respond to in the moment, with the options available in the moment. Caleb's options in the moment were limited. He packed his duffel. He took his notebook from the truck door panel and put it in his jacket pocket. He walked out of the Whitmore estate through the front door with Foss and his 2 associates maintaining a distance that was designed to feel like an escort without technically being one, and he got in his truck and drove down the gravel driveway between the old trees without looking back at the house. He drove about 2 miles down the road before he pulled over. He sat there with the engine running and his hands on the wheel and let himself have about 90 seconds of the feeling that came with being outmaneuvered on timing. The specific frustration of having a plan that was correct but not quite fast enough, of having all the right pieces and losing the initiative anyway. It wasn't a productive feeling. He gave it its 90 seconds, and then he put it away. Then he called Sandra Okafor. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake already. He told her what had happened in about 45 seconds of flat, factual summary. She was quiet for 3 seconds and then said, "The restraining order is a stall tactic. I'll have a response filed by noon. But listen, the independent physician I arranged is still going in this morning. Dr. Calloway. Caleb registered the name. Calloway. Walt told me about her. She was Serena's doctor before Reeve. She's also been trying to get access to that case for 6 months and has been blocked every time. Your spousal authority letter is what got her through the door. That letter is legally valid regardless of what Foss filed this morning, and Marguerite's attorneys will know that. A brief pause. They're going to try to have the marriage itself challenged next. They'll argue it was improperly administered, that Serena lacked capacity to consent, which she did. But the Vermont statute on spousal authority in medical incapacity cases is structured specifically to address situations like this. It will hold long enough. Long enough for what? Long enough for Dr. Calloway to document what she finds. Once that's in a medical report filed with the licensing board, the clinical picture is part of the official record and can't be managed away. He could hear her moving, the sound of papers. The financial evidence from the satchel. I had a forensic accountant begin preliminary review yesterday evening. What your father-in-law assembled is thorough. The shell company structure is complex, but it's all there. We're talking about 11 years of systematic embezzlement through fabricated vendor contracts, redirected procurement spending, and a set of real estate transactions that moved approximately $240 million out of the Whitmore Group and into a series of holding entities that trace back to Marguerite, Foss, and 2 board members. Caleb absorbed that number for a moment. And Dorian? Voss appears in this documentation in a secondary capacity. He wasn't in on the original scheme. He came in later. Edmund Whitmore had started a due diligence process on a proposed acquisition that Voss was brokering, and it appears Voss used that position to feed information to Marguerite about Edmund's movements. When Edmund found the evidence and planned to go to investigators, Voss knew about it before it happened. So he didn't build the trap, Caleb said. He just held the door open. That's a reasonable characterization, she paused. Caleb, what happened to Edmund Whitmore's cardiac event? I think you should be prepared for the investigation to go there eventually. He'd thought about that too, late at night in the estate house, when the shape of everything had been assembling itself in his head. A healthy man dead of a cardiac event. His daughter incapacitated 6 weeks later. The timing too useful to be coincidental once you knew what the utility was. Yeah, he said. I know. Go somewhere nearby. Stay available. Today is going to move fast. He drove to a diner in Grey Ridge called Meredith's that had been there since before he was born and ordered coffee and eggs. He wasn't particularly hungry and sat by the window where he could see both the door and the street. He called Walt, who answered on the 4th ring, with the particular alertness of a man who had also been anticipating a call. They walked him out this morning, Walt said. He wasn't asking. Yeah. Dr. Calloway is here. She arrived at 7:30. Miss Marguerite tried to turn her away at the door, and she handed someone a document and walked right past her. There was something in Walt's voice that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. She's been upstairs with Miss Serena for 40 minutes now. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment. Keep me posted. Already planned on it. He drank his coffee and watched Grey Ridge do its ordinary morning things through the diner window. A woman walking a dog. A delivery truck double-parked in front of the hardware store. A kid on a bicycle taking the corner too fast and then laughing at himself when he wobbled. The ordinary world continuing its ordinary operation, indifferent to the fact that 47 million things were in motion 12 miles away. His phone rang at 9:40. Sandra, Doctor, Calloway's preliminary findings are being filed with the medical licensing board as we speak, she said. She found evidence of a compounded sedative agent in the IV line consistent with prolonged pharmacological suppression of consciousness. The secondary port configuration is documented. Dr. Reeves' treatment records show systematic gaps and alterations. She's calling it deliberate medical interference. A pause. She's also saying that in her clinical opinion, Serena Whitmore should have been capable of regaining full consciousness weeks ago, possibly months, in the absence of the secondary medication. Caleb put his coffee cup down very carefully. The licensing board is initiating an emergency review of Reeves' credentials and referring the clinical findings to law enforcement, Sandra continued. Given that referral, the financial investigation moves to the front. I've already been in contact with the State Attorney General's office. They've been aware of anomalies in Whitmore Group corporate filings for about 8 months, but didn't have the internal documentation to move forward. They have it now. How long until they move on Marguerite and Foss? That's not something I can predict with certainty. But the AG's office does not drag its feet on nine-figure fraud cases, and when you add the medical angle, she stopped, found the word she wanted. They'll move today. I would expect that. They moved at 2 in the afternoon. Caleb heard about it from Walt, who called him from the estate grounds with a voice that had a quality he'd never heard from the man before. Something between relief and the particular tiredness that comes after a very long wait finally ends. There are 4 vehicles out front, Walt said. State police, 2 other cars, suits. They've been inside for about an hour. Is she all right? Dr. Calloway is still here. She hasn't left. A brief silence. Miss Serena was moved to Burlington Medical Center about an hour ago, by ambulance. Dr. Calloway rode with her. Caleb stood up from the chair in his rented house where he'd been waiting and picked up his jacket. What about Marguerite? Still inside as far as I can tell. Mr. Foss arrived about 20 minutes after the state vehicles. He didn't look well. Walt paused. Voss was here this morning and left before any of this happened. Made me think he had advance notice of some kind. He'll surface, Caleb said. They always do. He drove to Burlington. Burlington Medical Center was a different environment from the Whitmore estate in every way that mattered. Bright, institutional, staffed by people whose job was medicine rather than the performance of medicine. Dr. Calloway met him in the corridor outside the room they'd put Serena in, a small, precise woman in her early 60s who had the particular quality of calm that belonged to people who had been in difficult situations often enough to stop finding them dramatic. She looked at him with direct, assessing eyes. You're the husband. Caleb Turner. She's conscious, Calloway said. More coherent than I expected given what's been in her system. She's been fighting that medication for a while. Her body built up some tolerance, which paradoxically means the clearance is faster now that we've removed it. She paused. She's been asking for you. He went in. The room was plain and bright and smelled like a hospital, which was the least romantic setting imaginable for what turned out to be one of the more significant moments of Caleb Turner's life. Serena Whitmore was sitting up in a hospital bed, actually sitting up, pillows behind her, no monitoring leads except the standard pulse oximeter on her finger. And she looked like someone who had been through something serious and was still clearly in the early stages of processing that she'd made it through. Her color was better than it had been. Her eyes were fully focused, fully present, not fighting for purchase the way they'd been in those brief, costly emergencies over the past weeks. She looked at him when he came in with an expression he couldn't categorize precisely, which he attributed to the fact that their entire relationship so far had taken place at a significant disadvantage for at least one of them at any given time. You look taller than I expected, she said. Her voice was still rough from weeks of disuse, but it was a real voice. Not a whispered fragment fighting its way up from underwater. It was her actual voice, and there was something in it, even wrecked as it was, that suggested she was someone who usually used words with some care and had some wit available when needed. You look more awake than I expected, he said. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. Sit down, please. He pulled the chair close to the bed and sat. They looked at each other for a moment with the frank, slightly uncomfortable attention of 2 people who had shared a very strange situation without ever actually meeting. The satchel, she said first, with my attorney, already in the hands of the state AG's office. She exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep. My father spent 2 years building that case. He didn't tell me all of it because he didn't want me involved until he had enough to act on. And then She stopped and reset. And then he died. I know. And then I started asking questions, and I ended up... She looked at the room around her, the hospital walls, the ordinary institutional ceiling. Here. You fought it the whole time, he said. For what it's worth. You were in there fighting it. She looked at him directly. I heard you. When you talked to me at night. I wasn't always conscious enough to respond, but I heard you. A brief pause. You talked about your father's shop a lot. He felt something shift in his chest that he wasn't ready to examine in too much detail in a hospital room on a day that was already carrying more than its share of weight. Yeah, he said. I tend to. Roy Turner. He sounds like he was a good man. He was. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes going to the window. Outside, the Vermont sky was the specific gunmetal of late November, the kind of gray that sat on everything and made you feel the year was reaching its end. When she looked back, there was something more deliberate in her expression. "You didn't take the money," she said, "when Marguerite offered it." "No." "Why not?" He thought about how to answer that honestly without it sounding like either false modesty or something more than he had the right to claim yet. "Because it wasn't right," he said finally. "What they were doing to you. And I'd seen it, and I couldn't just take a check and drive away from it." She studied him with the careful, slightly unnerving attention of someone who had recently had very few ways to evaluate the world and had made those limited means count. "You could have," she said. "Plenty of people would have." "I know," he said. "I'm not plenty of people." That got the actual smile. Brief, tired, real. "No," she said. "You're apparently not." Over the next 72 hours, the thing that Sandra Okafor had set in motion continued moving at the pace of institutional mechanisms that, once engaged, didn't particularly require anyone to push them. Dr. Reeves surrendered his medical license voluntarily on the first day, which Sandra told Caleb was a classic preemptive move by someone whose attorney had done the math and concluded that voluntary surrender was marginally better than having it taken. He was still facing criminal charges. The licensing surrender didn't make those go away, it just removed one battlefield. Nurse Bright was placed on administrative suspension pending the medical board review and had retained counsel. The medical interference charges were, according to everyone who knew anything about such things, going to be the most straightforward part of the entire proceeding, because what Dr. Calloway had documented was specific, measurable, and not open to reasonable alternative interpretation. The financial fraud case was larger and slower and more complex, but the AG's office had sent 8 investigators to the Whitmore Group's offices on the morning after Serena's transfer to Burlington Medical Center, and the board members implicated in the shell company structure had each received formal notices that made continuing in their positions impractical. Marguerite Whitmore was placed under a travel restriction order while the investigation was active, which was the legal system's way of saying you're not going anywhere while we figure out exactly what you did. Gerald Foss was arrested on the second day. The Halset Bioprep connection, the medication supply chain running through his holding company directly to the hidden port in Serena's Ivor line, was the thread that turned a complex financial fraud case into something with a cleaner, more immediate criminal shape. His attorney issued a statement. Foss himself said nothing publicly, which was the right call for someone in his position, and also, Caleb thought, probably very difficult for a man who had spent his entire career being the person who talked. Dorian Voss disappeared for 36 hours, which turned out to mean he'd driven to a lake house he owned in New Hampshire and been sitting there trying to decide what to do. He came back voluntarily, with an attorney, and entered into conversations with the AG's office that were described in the careful language of people who meant cooperation agreement but were not yet ready to use those words publicly. Caleb spent those 72 hours mostly at the hospital, which was not something he'd planned, and which he accommodated by going home to his rented house once a day to feed himself properly, change his clothes, and sleep for a few hours in an actual bed. He and Serena talked more during that time than they had in all the weeks preceding it combined, which was not a high bar, but felt significant anyway. She asked him about the shop, not in the polite, making conversation way, but with genuine, specific curiosity, wanting to understand what the work actually was, what it felt like to know a machine well enough to diagnose it by sound. He told her about the '94 Chevy he'd been rebuilding when Foss had first walked into the garage, which had been sitting unfinished under a tarp since the morning he'd driven to the estate and hadn't been back. She told him about her father, not the Edmund Whitmore of corporate legend, but the actual man who'd apparently been capable of spending 3 hours in a hardware store looking for the exact right type of screw for a project he was doing in his study, and who had kept 3 different kinds of mechanical pencils and considered the choice between them a matter of genuine importance. "He would have liked you," she said, on the second evening, without preamble, in the way of someone who'd been thinking about something and decided to say it. "You can't know that," Caleb said. "No, I actually can. He had a very specific kind of person he liked, people who knew how things worked, who didn't perform." She paused. "He hated performance. He said the most dangerous person in any room was the one who was always performing because you could never tell what they actually wanted. Caleb thought about Dorian Voss. He wasn't wrong. She smiled. It was coming more easily now as the medication finished clearing her system and her body remembered how to do the things it had been doing automatically for 29 years. He was wrong about plenty of things. He trusted Marguerite too long. Her voice dropped slightly. She's his sister-in-law. He genuinely... She stopped. He thought family was a different category from everything else, that you could count on it differently. A lot of people think that. I know. It's just... She looked at her hands. She was the one who told me he died. She called me. She cried on the phone. I thought... She shook her head. It doesn't matter what I thought. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, it matters. It just doesn't change anything about what needs to happen now. She looked at him with that direct, assessing expression. You're not what I expected either. What did you expect? She considered it honestly, which he appreciated. Someone who'd done the math and decided the arrangement was worth it. Someone who'd be polite and useless. A brief pause. You were the opposite of useless. The math did work out fine for me, he said. I want to be clear about that. The shop debt was real. I needed the money. I know, that doesn't change what you did with the situation once you were in it. The board meeting happened on the 4th day. Sandra had prepared for it with the thoroughness of someone who understood that this was the procedural moment that would determine the institutional shape of everything that followed. The Whitmore Group's emergency board session had been convened under the company's crisis governance protocol, triggered by the simultaneous removal of 3 board members under the fraud investigation and the absence of the sitting chair due to the legal proceedings. What remained of the board? 4 members who had not been implicated, 2 of whom had apparently been quietly uncomfortable with certain financial decisions for years without having had the evidence to act on their discomfort, constituted a working quorum. Serena was discharged from Burlington Medical Center on the morning of the meeting. Dr. Calloway had cleared her with conditions: rest, follow-up appointments, a gradual return to full activity. Serena had listened to all of this with the polite attention of someone who intended to comply with the parts that made sense and make her own assessment of the rest. She walked out of the hospital under her own power, in clothes Dolores had brought up from the estate, and looked at the November sky for a long moment before getting into the car. Caleb drove. He hadn't been asked to. It had just become the arrangement, somehow, over the past 4 days, the way some things become the arrangement without anyone announcing it. The board meeting was held in the Whitmore Group's main offices in Burlington, a building Edmund Whitmore had chosen specifically for its views of Lake Champlain, which were significant. The conference room on the 14th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows on the lakeside, and the light coming through them on that particular November afternoon was the flat, luminous gray of a sky about to commit to winter. Serena walked into that conference room and the 4 remaining board members stood, which was either genuine respect or a calculated display of it, and Caleb, who had been prepared to wait in the lobby, was told by Serena in a tone that did not invite discussion to come in and sit down. He sat at the far end of the table and said nothing. This was not his domain, and he understood that. But he watched. Sandra was there, with her own presence that occupied more space than her physical size suggested. The documentation was already in front of the board: the forensic accounting summary, the shell company trace, the medical findings from Dr. Calloway, the criminal referrals. The board members had had versions of this for 2 days, but sitting in a room with Serena Whitmore, present, awake, and clearly herself, was a different experience from reviewing documents. Serena spoke for 40 minutes without notes. She wasn't performing. That was the thing Caleb kept coming back to, watching her. She wasn't doing the executive version of a speech, wasn't hitting marks or managing impressions. She was just telling a group of people what had happened, what it meant, and what she intended to do about it, with the specific authority of someone who had earned the right to be furious and had decided that fury was less useful than clarity. She covered the fraud, 11 years, $240 million, the mechanism, and the concealment. She covered the medical interference. She covered her father's death and the circumstances that she expected the investigation to examine further, which she said without visible emotion and with the specific weight of someone who has had time, too much time, in the dark and the silence and the slow fight against the current, to think about something until it has become a fact they carry, rather than a wound that's still open. She covered Dorian Voss's role and the board members who had enabled the financial scheme, directly or by willful incuriosity. She was precise and she was fair, meaning she said what the evidence showed and didn't embellish, but she also didn't soften what the evidence showed to spare anyone's feelings. Then she addressed the question of corporate governance going forward with a specificity that made it clear she had been thinking about this in whatever conscious hours she'd had for months. And at the end she said, "My husband exercised the spousal voting authority granted under the terms of my incapacity to ensure this evidence reached the appropriate parties, and that my medical care was reviewed by a qualified independent physician. I am formally ratifying every decision he made in that capacity and placing on the record my full confidence in his conduct." The board voted on the immediate measures: removal of the implicated members, appointment of an independent oversight committee, engagement of external auditors, a formal request for full investigative cooperation with the AG's office, unanimously and without significant discussion, because there was nothing left to discuss. The meeting was over in under 2 hours. In the elevator going down, Sandra checked something on her phone and said, without looking up, "The AG's office just announced the arrests: Marguerite Whitmore, Dr. Reeve, and 2 corporate officers. Voss's arrest is being processed as a related matter." She looked up. "It's done." Serena was looking at the elevator doors. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Not done, just the first part done." Sandra nodded. "Yes, that's more accurate." Caleb stood beside her and said nothing, because there wasn't anything that needed saying. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened onto the building's marble atrium, and beyond the glass entrance, Burlington went about its afternoon. Serena stood there for a moment at the threshold, with the particular stillness of someone who has been inside for a long time and is relearning what outside feels like. Then she looked at Caleb. "I want to see the shop," she said. He looked at her. "The shop?" "Turner's Auto, your father's place. I want to see it." He was quiet for a moment, trying to determine whether she was serious, and then determining from her face that she was entirely serious. "It's been closed for over a month. The bank has a notice on the door." "I know. I want to see it anyway." She held his gaze. "I have a feeling about that place." He thought about his father's hand-painted sign, faded to gray, the hinge on the service door, the '94 Chevy under its tarp, the things that were still there waiting, the way things waited when no one had decided yet what came next. "All right," he said. They walked out into the November afternoon and got in his truck, and he drove them south toward Gray Ridge, with the lake disappearing in the rear-view mirror and the road opening up ahead, and Serena Whitmore sat in the passenger seat of his 190,000-mile truck with its rust patch and its rattling heater, and looked out the window at the Vermont hills going gray and bare in the last of the autumn, and didn't say anything, and didn't need to. Turner's Auto looked exactly the way Caleb had left it, which was to say, it looked like a place that had been abandoned in the middle of something. The bank's notice was taped to the inside of the glass on the front door, visible from the parking lot. A yellow form with official language that managed to make the end of a man's livelihood sound like routine paperwork, which Caleb supposed it was, from the bank's perspective. The hand-painted sign above the bay doors had faded another shade or two since he'd last stood here looking at it. The foreclosure notice had a date on it that was still 4 days away, which meant technically the building still belonged to the Turner estate, or what remained of it, for 4 more days. Serena stood in the parking lot looking at the building for a long moment without saying anything. The afternoon light was failing fast, the way it did in Vermont in late November, dropping the temperature 10 degrees in the hour before dark. She had her coat pulled close and her hands in her pockets, and she was looking at the shop the way people look at things they're trying to understand from the outside before they go in. "It's bigger than I pictured," she said. 3 bays. My father added the 3rd one in 1999. Took him 2 years to save for it." Caleb unlocked the side door. He still had his key, which the bank's paperwork hadn't technically addressed yet, and pushed it open. The smell of the place hit him before he'd fully stepped through, oil and cold metal and the particular dry warmth of a space that had been closed up for weeks over concrete floors. It wasn't an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of most of his life. He turned the lights on. Fluorescent fixtures hummed to life in sequence, bay by bay. The '94 Chevy was still under its tarp in Bay 2, exactly where he'd left it on the morning Gerald Foss had walked in with his briefcase. Tools were racked where they belonged. The parts shelves along the back wall were organized in the system Roy Turner had established, and Caleb had maintained without modification because it worked, and there was no reason to change what worked. Serena walked in slowly, looking at everything. She stopped at the workbench and looked at the tools hung above it on the pegboard. The outlines Roy had painted around each one, so you always knew at a glance what was missing and where it went. "He did that himself?" she asked. "Yeah. Said it was the only management system that made any sense. You can see exactly what's there and exactly what isn't." She was quiet for a moment, her fingers almost touching the outline of a wrench that was hanging in its place. "My father had something like that in his study. A corkboard with pins, every project, every open question. He said a problem you could see was a problem you could solve." Sounds like they thought the same way. She turned and looked at him across the empty bay. The fluorescent light wasn't doing either of them any favors, which made everything feel more honest than it might have otherwise. "I want to buy the debt," she said. He'd been expecting something, but not that specific thing. "Serena, I know what you're going to say." "I don't think you do because I haven't said it yet." She waited. "I don't want it paid off as—" He stopped, looking for the right word and not loving the ones available. "I don't want it to be a thing you did for me. I need the shop to be mine because I earned it back, not because my wife has more money than the bank." She looked at him steadily. "The debt exists because Gerald Foss engineered your financial collapse to manufacture leverage over you. You didn't fail to earn anything. You were robbed." She said it without heat, just as fact. "What I'm proposing isn't charity, it's correction." He stood with that for a moment. She wasn't wrong, and he knew she wasn't wrong, and knowing that didn't make it entirely comfortable. That was the thing about being a particular kind of person. You could understand intellectually that pride in the wrong configuration became its own trap and still feel the pull of it. "Let me think about the structure," he said finally. "Fair enough." She turned back to the workbench. "Show me the Chevy." He pulled the tarp back. The 94 sat in its half-rebuilt state, patient as machinery always was, waiting without any particular opinion about how long it had been waiting. He walked her through what he'd been doing, the engine work, the bodywork still ahead, the specific challenge of sourcing original parts for a vehicle, this age without paying collector prices that made the whole project economically irrational. She listened carefully and asked good questions, the kind that showed she was actually tracking what he was saying rather than politely performing interest. She asked about the timeline. She asked what the car would be worth when it was done. She asked whether he ever got attached to them, the cars he restored, or whether after enough years it was just work. "Both," he said. "It's always both." She nodded like that made sense to her, which he appreciated. They stood there in the cold bay under the fluorescent lights with the half-finished Chevy between them, and the specific intimacy of that, two people in an empty garage at the end of a day that had been carrying about 10 days' worth of events, settled around them without requiring either of them to name it. "The contract expires in 6 days, Caleb said. He didn't look at her when he said it. He was looking at the Chevy's engine bay. "The marriage. The legal term ends." "I know," she said. "I want to be clear about something." He looked up then. "Whatever happens after that, whatever you decide, I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything. What I did because it was right, not as an investment." She met his eyes with the direct, careful attention that he'd come to understand was simply how she engaged with things that mattered to her. "I know that," she said. "That's the only reason we're having this conversation instead of a different one." He waited. "I've spent a long time, too long, most of it not by choice, being surrounded by people who were always calculating," she said. "What they could get, what position they'd be in. Even the people I thought I trusted, they were running numbers in the background, all the time." She paused. "You're the first person I've known in years who seemed to just be doing the thing in front of him, without the background calculation." "I'm not sure that's a virtue," he said. "It's just how I'm built." "Yes," she said. "That's what makes it a virtue." They stood with that for a moment in the quiet of the garage, with the November dark pressing against the high windows and the fluorescent lights making their small, persistent hum. "I'm going to need some time," she said, "before I know what I want. Normal time. Time where I'm actually awake and making choices from a position that isn't," she gestured vaguely, meaning the hospital, the estate, the preceding months. I need to be a person for a while before I know which decisions are mine. I understand that completely, he said. But I want you to know. She stopped, found the words she meant. I want you to know that when I figure out what I want, you're in the picture I'm looking at. That's not obligation, that's just true. Caleb looked at her across the half-rebuilt Chevy in the cold bay of his father's garage and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a long time. Longer than the past month, longer than the debt or the loss of Roy or the slow grinding decline of the shop. The specific unsettledness of a person who has been doing the right thing out of habit and stubbornness without being particularly sure it was adding up to anything. Okay, he said. She nodded. Okay. The months that followed were not a straight line, because nothing real ever is. Serena went back to work at the Whitmore Group in January, which was faster than Dr. Calloway recommended and exactly as fast as Serena had decided. And those two facts coexisted in a tension that resolved itself when the results proved her right, which Calloway acknowledged with the particular grace of a physician who respected evidence even when it argued against her advice. The company was in a state that required a great deal of steady, unglamorous work, the kind of rebuilding that happened after a long institutional corruption, where you had to examine everything because you couldn't be sure which pieces were clean and which weren't. She was good at it. Not in the effortless way of someone for whom things come easily, but in the real way, the grinding it out way, the staying in the room and keeping your eyes open way. She hired 2 new board members with backgrounds in forensic governance, replaced the CFO with a woman who had spent 15 years at a regulatory agency and had the institutional memory of someone who had seen every variety of financial misconduct and wasn't impressed by any of them. She engaged an independent monitor for the duration of the AG's investigation, which was a move her new counsel said wasn't legally required, and which she did anyway because she wanted the Whitmore Group to be the kind of company that did things it wasn't required to do when those things were right. The AG's case moved at the pace of large, complex criminal proceedings, which was not fast. Marguerite Whitmore entered a plea arrangement in March that, in exchange for full cooperation, produced a sentence that most observers considered light, and that Serena said nothing about publicly and said what she actually thought about only to Caleb, and only once, in a conversation that he kept entirely to himself. Dr. Reeve was convicted on 4 counts of criminal medical interference and lost his license permanently. Gerald Foss fought his charges through 2 rounds of motions, lost both, and was ultimately convicted on 11 counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and his role in the medication supply chain. His sentencing came in late spring and was reported briefly in the business press and more extensively in the medical ethics journals, which seemed appropriate. Dorian Voss cooperated fully, as Sandra had predicted, and received a reduced sentence that required him to be elsewhere for the next several years. He sent Serena a letter before sentencing that she read once and did not respond to and did not save. The investigation into Edmund Whitmore's death was the longest and most difficult piece of the proceeding. The medical examiner's office reviewed the original findings with the benefit of the new evidence context, and in April, 5 months after Serena had walked out of Burlington Medical Center, issued a revised determination that changed the manner of death from natural to undetermined, pending toxicological analysis that the original autopsy had not conducted. The final determination came in June. Caleb was with Serena when she got the call, and he sat with her afterward in silence for a long time, in the garden of the estate that was hers again now, and was slowly becoming something different from what it had been under Marguerite's management. The recording device is gone, the staff no longer moving with that particular practiced invisibility, Walt's roses given the attention they'd been quietly waiting for. She didn't cry that afternoon in the garden. He didn't expect her to. She'd had months to prepare for what the determination might be. And the thing about preparing for something terrible for long enough was that the confirmation sometimes arrived as a completion rather than a new wound. It was still terrible. It was just known. And known things, however bad, had a different weight than the suspected, half-seen things that lived in the space before certainty. He was right to be afraid, she said finally. Yeah. And he was right to put it in the car, to plan for it. She looked at the garden, at Walt moving along the far row of the rose bed with his characteristic unhurried exactness. He always said the only thing you could control was what you prepared. My father used to say something similar, different words. She looked at him. What were his words? Stay in the room. Keep your eyes open. He paused. It sounds simpler than it is. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. I think it's exactly as simple as it sounds. The hard part is doing it when you don't want to. Turner's Auto reopened in February. The debt resolution had taken a form that Caleb eventually accepted, not as a gift and not as a correction exactly, but as a legal remedy. Sandra Okafor's work on the fraud case had established clearly that the loan acceleration had been engineered, which gave him standing to challenge the bank's demand schedule on grounds of predatory manipulation. The challenge succeeded. The actual outstanding balance, the real debt, the money Roy had legitimately borrowed and legitimately owed, was restructured at a rate that Caleb could service from operating revenue, the same way the loan should always have been structured. He paid it back over time, monthly, the way his father had originally intended. That was important to him in a way he couldn't fully explain to anyone who hadn't grown up the way he had, with a father who believed that what you built with your hands and your word was the only kind of building that held. He couldn't explain it fully, so he mostly didn't try. Serena understood it without explanation, which was one of several things about her that continued to catch him slightly off guard. The shop's reopening was not an event. There was no ceremony, no ribbon, nothing that announced itself. He unlocked the door on a Monday morning in February and turned the lights on, and the fluorescent fixtures hummed, and the smell of oil and cold metal was exactly what it always was. And Petra from the Whitmore estate, who had left the estate's employ in December, and after a conversation with Caleb that he hadn't entirely anticipated, was now learning automotive service work with the focused intensity of someone who had always wanted to understand how things worked and had simply never been given the opportunity, was there with coffee when he arrived. Walt came by on the second day, not for any repair but just to see the place, which Caleb understood. He walked through all 3 bays with the same methodical attention he gave to the estate grounds and then stood in front of Roy Turner's hand-painted sign for a while. Good, he said finally. That was the whole review. It was enough. Dolores, who had stayed on at the estate and whose institutional knowledge was proving invaluable to Serena in ways that went well beyond housekeeping, brought a covered dish by on the 3rd day and left it with Petra without explanation, which was also exactly right. The '94 Chevy was finished in April. It had taken Caleb the better part of 6 months off and on, which was longer than he'd planned and shorter than the job deserved. But it ran clean and straight, and the bodywork had come out better than he'd hoped, which was the best outcome you could honestly hope for with a car that age. He drove it around the block twice, which was his traditional test for a finished restoration, and then he parked it in the lot and sat on the hood and felt the specific satisfaction of a completed thing. He'd thought about what to do with it for a while. He could sell it. The market for restored vehicles in that condition was real, and the money would help the shop's recovery. He'd half planned to sell it from the beginning. Instead, he drove it out to the estate on a Saturday morning. Serena was in the garden with a cup of coffee, which had become one of her Saturday habits now that spring had made the garden habitable again. She looked at the car when he pulled up the gravel drive, and then looked at him with an expression that was partly surprise and partly something more complicated. "It's done," he said. She walked around it slowly, the way she'd walked through the shop that first evening, taking it in seriously, not performing appreciation, but actually looking. She stopped at the driver's door and looked at him over the roof. "Can I drive it?" He tossed her the keys. She drove it the length of the drive and back, which was not really enough road to tell you much about a car, and then she parked it and sat in it for a moment with the engine off before getting out. She handed the keys back with a look on her face that he couldn't immediately read. "It's a good car," she said. "It is now." She looked at the house, then back at him. "Stay for coffee." He stayed for coffee, and then for lunch, and then the afternoon was doing what November afternoons did in Vermont, going dark and cold earlier than you wanted. And there was a conversation happening between them that had been accumulating for months, made up of all the small things said and unsaid in all the various rooms and situations they'd moved through since the previous November. They were sitting in the kitchen, not the formal dining room, the actual kitchen, which Serena had reclaimed from its role as a staff-only space and made into the room where she spent most of her time at home. And she was looking at her coffee cup and he was looking at the window, and she said, without particular preamble, "The contract expired 5 months ago." "I know. We're legally not married." "I know." She looked up. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this without it sounding like—" She stopped, made a small, frustrated gesture. "I rehearsed this, which was a mistake, because now I can hear myself rehearsing and it sounds wrong." "Then don't rehearse it," he said. She looked at him. "I want to marry you. Actually marry you. Not a contract, not a legal mechanism. Just, I want you to be my husband because I want that. Because you are, in every way that matters to me, the person I want to be building my life with." She paused. "That's what I was trying to say." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the estate's grounds were doing their spring evening thing, the light going golden in the last half hour before it dropped entirely. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. This woman he'd met when she was unconscious, who had fought her way up through a chemical fog to warn a stranger she had no reason to trust, who had walked into a boardroom with the confidence of someone who understood exactly what she was doing, who asked good questions about engines and had her father's instinct for systems, and still, sometimes, at the end of a long day, had the look in her eyes of someone who was relearning how much it was safe to trust the ground under her feet. "I'm not easy," he said. "I want to be clear about that going in. I have opinions about the right way to do things that I'll argue for past the point of reason. I'll worry about the shop at 2 in the morning and wake you up. I won't always know how to talk about what's bothering me." "I know all of that," she said. "And you still want to marry me?" "I still want to marry you." He nodded slowly. "Then yes." She smiled, not the brief managed smile of the early weeks, but a real one, the kind that changed her whole face. "Yes?" "Yes." They were married on a Saturday in late May, in Bay 2 of Turner's Auto, which had been cleaned more thoroughly than it had ever been cleaned in its operational history, and which still smelled faintly of oil in a way that seemed, to the people assembled there, like exactly right. There was no production to it. No caterer, no florist, no vendor of any kind. Dolores and Petra had put folding chairs in 2 short rows and hung small lights along the rafters, which in the filtered morning light through the shop's high windows looked more beautiful than anything elaborate would have. Walt was there, in a jacket that looked like it had been pressed very recently. Dr. Calloway came, which had been Serena's specific request. Sandra Okafor was there with her husband, who turned out to be a quietly funny man who laughed at the right things. Hank Riley, who turned out to be deeply mortified by his unwitting role in Caleb's financial manipulation, and had spent the past several months trying to make various forms of amends that Caleb had accepted with varying degrees of grace, sat in the back row and was visibly glad to have been invited. Justice Henderson performed the ceremony as he had the first time. But the difference between this ceremony and that one was so total that the only thing they shared was the same pair of hands speaking the same words. This time, Serena was standing in a pale dress she'd chosen because she liked it and for no other reason. This time Caleb was in a jacket he'd bought the previous week, and which fit well enough, though he'd left the tie at home because there were limits. This time both of them were choosing. He put a ring on her finger that she'd picked out herself, a simple thing, plain gold without ornament, which she'd said was what she wanted, and which turned out to be exactly right for her hand. She put a ring on his that was the same. She'd had them made matching, which he hadn't known until the moment, and which did something to his chest that he didn't try to examine or name. Henderson said the words. They said yes when asked. And it was done. Not legally, not on paper, not as a mechanism for anything other than the thing itself. Afterward, Petra had made food, because Petra had turned out to have an unexplored talent for feeding people that had been waiting under the surface of a very different job for a long time. Walt sat beside Hank, who turned out to be a man Walt had known peripherally for years, and they talked about Roy Turner in the quiet way of people for whom remembering someone was a form of conversation. Sandra's husband fixed the latch on the supply room door without being asked, which Caleb discovered later and appreciated deeply. Serena stood in the middle of Bay 2 with a glass of something and looked at the shop around her, at Roy Turner's pegboard and his hand-painted outlines, at the hydraulic lift in Bay 1, at the fluorescent lights doing their particular neutral job of illuminating everything without favoring anything. And Caleb came and stood beside her and followed her gaze around the room. "Is it what you expected?" he asked. "I didn't have an expectation," she said. "That's the thing. I'm getting better at not having expectations, just being in the thing. He understood that. He'd been learning it himself in a different way over the past several months. The kind of person he was, the kind his father had been, tended to deal with uncertainty by building structure around it, by keeping his hands moving and his eyes open and his mind focused on the practical next thing. That had its value. It had gotten him through situations that a different kind of person might not have navigated. But it was also, he'd come to understand, a way of staying at a slight remove from things, of managing experience rather than having it. He was working on that. "Your father would have liked today," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "He would have." "My father, too." He looked at the pegboard. "He'd have said something dry about it, and then he'd have gone and offered everyone more food." She laughed. The real laugh. The one that came from somewhere unguarded. "That sounds like a description of a good person." "Yeah," Caleb said. "It does. There's a version of this story where you walk away with a simple lesson. Something about love conquering all, or justice being inevitable, or good people getting what they deserve. The truth, as anyone who has lived any significant portion of a life can tell you, is more complicated and also, strangely, more worth having than the simple version. Serena Whitmore had everything taken from her. Her health, her father, her ability to make choices, her control over the world her father had built. And what she discovered in the long dark months when she was fighting just to surface long enough to say a few words to a stranger she couldn't be sure she could trust, was that the thing hardest to take from a person is the capacity to keep trying. It doesn't feel like much from the inside. It doesn't feel like strength. It feels like stubbornness and exhaustion and the absence of any better option. But it is in fact exactly strength, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that is most visible to the people watching from outside. Caleb Turner had spent most of his adult life doing work that the world didn't particularly notice, keeping the systems that other people's lives ran on from failing and feeling the slow erosion of a life that was built right but built small. He had walked into a situation that most people would have treated as a transaction, which it was, initially, and found that he was incapable of treating it as only a transaction, because at some point you are confronted with the clear evidence of a wrong being done, and the only question left is whether you are the kind of person who looks away. He was not that kind of person. He had not been raised to be that kind of person. It cost him something. It almost cost him a great deal. And he would do it the same way again. That is the thing worth holding on to in a story like this, if you are going to hold on to anything. Not the romance, though the romance is real. Not the justice, though the justice matters. The thing worth holding on to is the simpler fact underneath both of those, that the quality of a person is not determined by their circumstances, but by what they do inside those circumstances, and that decency is not a luxury available only to people who have enough cushion to afford it. It is a choice. Made in small rooms, under fluorescent lights, at 2 in the morning when no one is watching and there is no particular reward for making it. Roy Turner had known that. Edmund Whitmore, in his own way, had known it too. Had known it well enough to spend 2 years quietly building a record of the truth, leaving it in a car, trusting that someone would eventually find it. They had both been right to know it. On the last Monday of May, Caleb Turner unlocked the side door of Turner's auto at 7:15 in the morning, turned on the fluorescent lights bay by bay, and started on a '78 Ford pickup that had come in the previous Friday, needing more work than its owner had budgeted for, which was almost always how it went. Petra was already there, coffee made, working through the service log with the focused attention she brought to everything. The hand-painted sign above the bay doors said Turner's Auto in letters that were faded to gray and would probably need repainting before winter. He made a note to do that. His phone rang at 8:30. Serena calling from her office in Burlington between meetings, because she did that some mornings now, and not always, not routinely, just when there was something she wanted to say before the day pulled her fully into its current. "How's the Ford?" she asked. "Worse than it looks," he said, which is saying something. "Can you save it?" He looked at the truck on the lift, at the particular combination of age and neglect and amateur intervention that he was going to have to work through one honest repair at a time. "Yeah," he said. "It'll take longer than I want, but yeah." "Good," she said. And he could hear the smile in it, the specific warmth of someone who understood exactly why that mattered. "I'll call you tonight." She hung up. He put his phone in his jacket pocket and went back to the truck. Outside, Maple Creek Road was doing its ordinary Monday morning things, indifferent and continuous and entirely itself. The world was full of systems that needed someone to stay in the room, keep their eyes open, and do the work in front of them without flinching. He picked up his tools and got